President Donald Trump wants Obamacare repealed. He also has public approval ratings below 40%. Bad! The media is in a tailspin of epic proportions. This is not surprising to anybody that's been paying attention to media coverage for the last many years, and in my case, for the last many decades. The media is supposed to be a stalwart element of our republic, and could be, but unfortunately it's not an honest media anymore. There was a time when it was more honest than it is now, and there was a time when it was considerably more honest but looked really different. In the beginning of our republic, you had tremendous biases in the nation's newspapers, but they were known and seen biases, specifically early on, the biases for Jefferson and for Adams. There were Jefferson newspapers in Philadelphia. There were Adams newspapers in Boston. These were papers that were overtly and clearly and upfront for their guy. And readers, consumers of those newspapers, knew that. So while that wasn't maybe the best of all worlds, because it allows for all the siloing effect that goes on now, it did allow for a great deal of transparency and honesty in the media. Now, in the mid-19th century, mid-20th century, in America, what you have seen and what you saw was a transition to a more professional journalistic class. You had college degrees, communications degrees. I have a degree in journalism. And what you see and saw at that time, particularly around the era of Watergate, you saw a lot of professional journalists get in and want to be fair, objective, professional, honest. I think a lot of them really did. And the problem that was run into right away was that almost all of the professors at the communication schools in the colleges were liberal. And so a lot of the journalist students and the young journalists were coming out of the classroom and into newspapers and into television stations, and they had been inculcated in a liberal mindset to some degree. So then they were surrounded by a lot more. The problem is that resulted was that you had newsrooms around the country that, even starting in the 80s, when I started in journalism in 1982, I had my first job, and through the 80s I saw increasing bias, particularly related to Ronald Reagan. By the 90s, the biases were just overtly clear to me. Now, not to everybody else, but to me, because I could sit in a newsroom with 40 or 50 other reporters and editors and assistant editors and copy editors and be the only conservative in there. This was not an unusual situation. And there is no way, if you flip that, and that we are all conservatives except for one liberal, there's no way that the ensuing news coverage would be anything other than heavily conservative. There's just no way. But instead of trying to correct the worldview imbalance, newspapers decided to go after diversity based on the worst and most superficial of all, and that is skin color and gender. So they created this concept for the newsroom where if you had a liberal black and a liberal white and a liberal woman and a liberal gay, you had diversity. But you didn't. What you had was a bunch of liberals. And that is exactly what was reflected in news coverage, because there was no check and balance throughout the system, from reporter to assistant city editor to managing editor to executive editor. There was no check and balance that would say, did we talk about this? Did we ask about that? Why are we covering it this way? Why would you go after this story in the first place? Why not this other story? There was none of that, because they were all of a similar worldview. Now, they saw dissimilarities between themselves because they weren't all the exact same type of liberal, but they were all left of center. And that's just the way it was, and it still is that way. And the problem is that without those checks and balances, you ended up with the heavily biased newspapers and television stations that we've all become used to. Those of us that are conservatives and are consumers of news, we've just become used to the idea that that apparently modern day journalism is just inherently liberal, and it is. There's really no argument against that, other than, interestingly, those practicing modern day journalism, most all of them refuse to see it or cannot see it. I think a lot of them honestly can't see it. Because they have got in their minds that that good journalism is liberal. It's not connected that way overtly in their minds, but the synapses are connecting there. All the awards are given to liberal stories because they're all being judged by liberal journalists. So everything ends up being liberal or left of center to some degree, but the journalists can't see it. And so it's always been a disconnect with them that Republicans and conservatives get so upset at the biases because they don't see it. They don't think there are biases. They actually just basically think they're doing a good job, and too bad for you guys. So because they have purposely tried to not blind themselves, we find ourselves in this time now, and of course Trump has just driven it off the rails, but it was getting worse and worse and worse and worse. And so what I want to do is start a regular series at the Revolutionary Act here, where I dissect the news. After 25 years in newspapers at virtually every level and type of job, and in different parts of the country, I think I'm fairly uniquely qualified to dissect the news and to analyze it and to be able to show you where the biases are. In just your everyday news stories, you can look at these and you can see the biases. You can see where it's happening. You can see it in word choice, in lead choice, and what's not there, and the lack of context, etc., which would not be the case if there was balance in a newsroom, but there aren't balances in the newsrooms. Instead, now what we have is everything from the Daily Caller and Breitbart and all sorts of conservative websites, and then you have liberal websites like Huffington Post and others that are really not that different from the New York Times, frankly. And it's not like every single media paper out there is the exact same, but they're all similar. They're all left of center. Even my friends like to talk about the Wall Street Journal and how the Wall Street Journal is conservative. No, the Wall Street Journal editorial page is conservative. But the Wall Street Journal news hole, which is where all the stories are, the front pages and everything, that is not conservative. That is peopled by roughly center and left of center journalists, and it's going to reflect that, and it does. And I'll go through Wall Street Journals in coming YouTubes. I will go through YouTube. That sounds funny. I will go through Wall Street Journals and show you the biases in the news hole there. But I want to start today with an AP story. It's just a straight AP story, very simple, basic AP story that is on the Obamacare vote that's scheduled in the Senate today. So for a lot of you watching this, you'll probably already know the results of it. But the point of this is not to show the propheticness or what's going to happen or not happen. The point is to show the media is biased in it. And so it's an AP story, and for those of you that don't know, the AP stands for Associated Press. The Associated Press is a consortium of hundreds of newspapers and television stations around the country. They pay a fee based on their viewership or readership, and then they get to run and pull stories off the AP wire and run them. And so the AP has an awful lot of influence because it can actually be run in papers all over the country, and it is. So it was in my local newspaper here in Sarasota, Florida, where I read it this morning. But then when I Googled it online to find it, the first one that came up was at the Washington Post. And so I read that one, and that's the one we'll be using from. But I want to show you what it is first. If you take a look here, the headline is Reasons Why Healthcare Bill Would Fail. Well, for me as a journalist, that is a red flag of a headline. But of course, they can't see that. Reasons Why the Healthcare Bill Would Fail. It's by Alan Fram of the Associated Press. There is no label on here that suggests opinion. It's not on the opinion pages. It's in the news hole. This was on page, I don't know, first section 3 or 5 or 4 or something. And there's not even that sort of fungible analysis sort of thing where reporters try to kind of zing in their opinions. Without it being an opinion, they can still be considered a reporter. So they do an analysis. Whenever you see analysis, what you're getting is an opinion. Some do it better than others. But still, it's an opinion, and I wish they would just keep it clearly delineated, but they don't. And of course, it's always from left of center. It's relentlessly, incessantly from left of center, and readers are seeing that. So let's just go through this story quickly, and so I can show you exactly what is going on with it and how you can see these various types of biases in your local paper or in however you consume news, assuming you're not totally just getting it from conservative news sites. It's Washington Dateline. There are many reasons why the Senate will probably reject Republicans' crowning bill raising much of former President Barack Obama's health care law. Now, right there, that word raising, that should raise some red flags too. An editor should say, oh, let's tone that down. That's a little bit partisan sounding. I mean, raising is destroying, right? You're knocking it down. You're destroying it. There are fewer why the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell might revive it and avert a GOP humiliation. Leaders say the Senate will vote Tuesday on their health care package. The latest bill by McConnell. Here's the first problematic paragraph. Third paragraph in the story. The latest bill by McConnell, a Republican, Kentucky, and it could change anew, would end penalties for Democrat Obama's health care law slapped on people without insurance and on larger companies not offering coverage to workers. It would erase requirements that insurers cover specified medical services, cut Medicaid health insurance program for the poor, and shrink subsidies for many consumers. So I think you can probably see the way I read that. Just the whole paragraph slapping down, erasing requirements that insurers cover specified medical insurance. So throughout this, you understand the dynamic is insurers are evil. I'm not really a fan of insurance companies, but they're corporations. And so for the liberal mindset, which is the same thing as the media mindset, corporations are the bad guys. And it would erase requirements that they cover specified medical devices because, of course, we want the government to tell them exactly what to do in every single point. The liberal mindset does. It would cut Medicaid health insurance program for the poor. It would cut it for the poor. So there we have the opposite end because Republicans clearly love big corporations, even though big corporations give more money to Democrats. This is an old saw now that hasn't been accurate for a long time. But Republicans hate the poor. And it would shrink subsidies for many consumers, so shrinking subsidies. So there's no context in this whatever. None of this has to do with costs. You can see every single one of these things that's being considered is actually expensive and in opposition to personal liberties. But that never crosses the mind of Alan Fram writing this because it doesn't cross the mind of the liberal. So it doesn't cross his mind. It doesn't cross the mind of the AP editors before they sent it out on the wire, and it doesn't cross the mind of any of the newspapers that I read. And I suspect it's going to be true of all of them. They're going to just pick it up and run it in there. And so Washington Post, you would think, would have the most extra eyes on it. Didn't raise any flags for them. Why? Because they're all looking at it from a liberal worldview. So the article goes on here. It fails, awful poll numbers. Okay, well, there's another red flag. Awful poll numbers is hardly what you want that you would see in an objective story. You would just be reporting them, and the viewer can decide, reader in this case, can decide if they're awful or not. In Associated Press NORC Center for Public Affairs Research, I do not know what NORC is, poll this month, 51% supported Obama's statute, while 22% backed GOP legislation. Perhaps more ominously for Republicans, the AP NORC poll found that by a 25% percentage point margin, most think it's the federal government's responsibility to ensure all Americans have coverage. That's a growing view. There was just a 5 percentage point gap in March. It underscores the harsh reality for the GOP. It's hard to strip benefits from reporters. Well, yeah. That's what a lot of us conservatives were saying before they slapped on all these billions and tens of billions and hundreds of billions of dollars in giveaways. Taxpayer money to other people in the form of benefits. Because once you start giving people stuff from the government, it gets very, very hard to take it away, particularly when you don't have principled Republicans in Congress. And I think there's a lot of Republicans that are not principled conservatives. They're Republicans, but they're not very principled in their conservatism. Or if they were, They're not once they've been in Washington for a while. But the real problem with this from a media bias point of view is that the context of this is that if you were doing good reporting, you would look at this and there would be a glaring question that requires answering. And that is this: after 6 years of this law, there was only a 5 percentage point gap that think it's the government's responsibility to ensure all Americans have coverage. Barely a 5%, almost within the margin of error, until March. And between March now and July, it's gone up to a 25% margin. So a good reporter that wasn't agenda reporting, that wasn't propagandizing, would say, how in the world did it go up 400%? 400 flipping percent? That seems like a huge story. We should have something in there explaining that, but they don't, because it's not the point to explain. It's the point of this story is to persuade, and specifically, as we'll get into in the next chunk here, it is to persuade wobbly Republicans to vote against it, because that's what the liberal mindset would want. The bias is just overwhelming in the story. I just grabbed it off. I can do this every day. If I have the time, I'll do it every day. It's just so easy to show, but it's really important to show too, because so many people don't really believe it. Even people that are moderate Republicans, they don't really believe it. So the next subset here is awful CBO numbers. Again, awful. Now he's doing this with each subhead, but it's an opinion word. The Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office. First thing you have to remember is that whenever you see Congressional Budget Office preceded by nonpartisan, it's being modified by nonpartisan, you know that the reporter is trying to get you to take this seriously, which comes next. They're trying to give an air of undeniable credibility to what comes next, because it's nonpartisan. It's really important to say that. You will find, if you were to read it closely, that as stories are done, as CBO estimates come out on things that look good for a conservative bill, which actually they rarely will for different reasons, but you will often not find that modifier of nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office. It gets dropped at times. You see this throughout the differences between Republican Congresses and Democrat Congresses, between Republican White Houses and Democrat White Houses. When Republicans won it in 1992 for the first time in forever under Newt Gingrich, and yeah, I was in newsrooms then and I was reporting on it, and the terminology that was used all the time was a Republican takeover. It was like they'd taken over the government. It's like a coup. It was reported that way all the time because, of course, it should be Democrats in charge all the time, because that would be the view of your basic newspaper reporter. So let's read this paragraph. The Nonpartisan Congressional Budget. The Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office says under McConnell's plan, 22 million more people will be uninsured by 2026, mostly Medicaid recipients and people buying private policies. This paragraph is actually a little bit better written than a lot of them. A lot of them are saying 22 million people will be kicked off. 22 million people will lose their coverage. The problem is that a huge number of those, actually probably the majority of those, are people who never wanted it in the first place, and it was the penalties under the Obama law that forced them to buy a product in the first place that they didn't want. I mean, I think they should want it. I think even if you're young and healthy, you should. It's cheap to have, and you don't know that you'll be young and healthy, or you don't know that you'll be healthy in 3 months. You'll probably still be young. And so, but that's my opinion. I do not believe the government should tell them what they have to do, or any of us what we have to do in regards to what we buy and don't buy. It's not the government's role. And that should have been ruled unconstitutional, but of course we know there was a political calculation there in which it wasn't on a 5-4 vote. That was upheld. That was the biggest hiccup there, that forcing people to buy it. But so in this paragraph, he knows that. He's got to know that. This David Fram must know that. Either if he doesn't know that, then he's not very good at his job at all as a reporter. My guess is if he's working for the AP in Washington, he's covering Congress here, that he knows that. He knows that most of those people are people who chose not to be covered in the first place, and will choose again not to be covered. It's just a choice. But he doesn't include that anywhere, just like most of his comrades. Poor choice of words. Just like most of his colleagues in newsrooms choose not to. So, you know, there's the bias right there. And bias is so often what's not reported. And I know that I have a leg up on that as a former reporter. I can see it more clearly, but it is so often what's not reported that is the problem. Next sentence in that paragraph. For single people, the typical deductible out-of-pocket expenses for insurance defrays costs, before insurance defrays costs, would balloon that year to $13,000, up from $5,000 under Obama's law. Now, this would be a great time to point out that the CBO's estimates regarding healthcare laws have been wildly wrong. I mean, just like laughably circus level wrong. They were wrong on the Obamacare one. They've just been so wrong. There is no reason any rational person should put any faith in any of these numbers at all, because by track record with the CBO, you can't expect them to be accurate. That would be a good place for good journalism to include how inaccurate these numbers have been in the past, so the reader will have that context in there. He doesn't do that because he's not trying to be a good reporter here. He's trying to persuade wobbly Republicans to vote against repeal. And so this whole article is about that, over and over and over. And then it gets down here and he talks about presidential drag. President Donald Trump wants Obamacare repealed. He also has public approval ratings below 40%. Bad! Exclamation point. And a propensity for turning on people. Well, here's the deal. This really should be on the opinion page. At the very least labeled analysis, which I don't like or really particularly trust anyway. But having it in the news hole is just horrific. First of all, when he says bad, exclamation point, obviously he's mocking the way Trump tweets. At the end of his tweets, he often uses bad or not fair or whatever with an exclamation point because he's squishing it into 140 characters. So he's mocking the president right there. This would also be a good time for me to point out, it's an awful lot to ask of a media person to point out, but the approval ratings are simply a mirror of the news coverage of a topic or a person. Whenever you see polls and the media is reporting on them and it's on something that has been heavily in the news, what you can count on for sure is that that poll will reflect the news coverage. There's no way around it. That's how people are going to form their opinion. They're going to be consumers of news from whatever sources, and they're going to form their opinions based on that. So, as we know, very recently here, the famous Harvard study that looked at the, I believe it was, I know it was CNN, and I think it was ABC, CBS, NBC, and looked at their coverage in Trump's first 6 months. It was something like 93% negative. It might have been just CNN that was 93% negative, which would be enough, and the others were in the 80s. Point being, overwhelmingly negative coverage, far beyond previous presidents, even Republican presidents. The fact that he's only just below 40% in approval ratings is actually quite astonishing. What it shows is his base is ignoring the media, and this is a part of the problem with the media. So the point of this story, like so many, is to persuade, is to propagandize is probably an overly strong word and it's overly used, but is to persuade, in this case, Republicans on the fence in the Senate that might think about voting for it, to give them all the reasons why they should vote against it, because the good liberal journalist mindset is that it shouldn't be repealed because Obamacare has been good for people, which it demonstrably has not been good for people. Net. It's been good for some, it's been bad for some. It looks like net, it's been bad. So I hope that you can see the value in being able to dissect stories this way. You can read a lot more about this and a lot of topics at the revolutionaryact.com, where we write on a broad range of topics. We have constitutional experts and elected officials and government leaders that all approach the world from a right of center view, but not all the same right of center, and give you expert commentary and analysis into what is going on in the day's events. So you can put into context, like I'm doing in journalists here in the media, constitutionally what's happening and politically what's happening and what a good government would look like. We have an expert who is fantastic on seeing around the corner and what's required for good operations of government, because we need it. And just terrific stuff. So if you are interested in those, please check out the revolutionaryact.com. Please subscribe below here to our YouTube channel at The Revolutionary Act, is we're going to be kicking these out now on a regular basis to try and really help people see the problem with the media, because we need an informed electorate. And the more we can inform middle America, right America, a lot of it already knows, but middle America, particularly I know new Trump voters who are kind of new to the political process and all, this would be an excellent way for them to be able to really start to see how to digest the news media and how to read it sort of defensively and with a critical mind, so that they are not propagandized, so they're not swept in and persuaded by biased news reporting.